Anyway, so this whole prisons thing, which is really going to come to a head, it sounds like on Friday morning with the official announcement. For people who've observed the whole system, as you've done for many years, was it pretty obvious that this point was coming?
It was inevitable. I mean, we've had years and years of an arms race between the two parties who's going to be tougher on crime. We've had more and more offences created. We've had sentences increased. We've had remission reduced. We've had less people being put out on parole. It's a bit like running a brewery without manufacturing any bottles. So we've now reached the position where judges will be sending people to prison and there will literally be no cells for them to go in. So this was inevitable. It's been coming for a long time, and it's a huge failure of public policy, a monumental failure.
So basically it's an increased demand for prison places, but with no increased supply of prison places to meet the demand.
Government didn't want to pay for prisons. I mean, they've got a rather failing prison building program at the moment. They were promising an extra 20,000 places, but we've only got 5,000 so far, and we're not going to reach that target till 2030. That's far too long away. So it's a system which is really in a state of collapse, and that's why they're being forced to act.
But that suggests that one of the things that Keir Starmer has said about this is that actually the situation he's inherited is even worse than he thought it was going to be. That doesn't really hold water based on what you've just said.
Well, I think they knew it was going to be bad. I mean, I cut them a bit of slack here. I think when you're in opposition, you never quite know the precise detail of the figures, and when you get into government, you open up the books and you get more information. But I think Keir must have. I know he had a pretty good idea that this was coming, because Alex Chalk has been talking about it coming, and Alex Chalk was trying to...
Previous Justice Secretary.
And he was trying to persuade Rishi to do something about it, and Rishi wouldn't, because we were in an election period, and the only way to deal with this is to let people out of prison, which is not a great policy necessarily to be running at a time of an election.
And the reason we know that those conversations were happening behind closed doors in the previous government is because they leaked out in front of doors.
Yeah, and because Alex Chalk confirmed them to the BBC today, that he'd been arguing for this and didn't make much headway with the Prime Minister.
And I understand Team Rishi, well, the members of Team Rishi Sunak that still exist have not disputed his account. So
don't think
that's
they could.
As close as confirming it. Yeah,
I think it is confirmed. Yeah.
So listening though to Alex Chalk on the other amazing podcast that is made in this studio, he seemed to be putting a lot of the blame on the backlog in the court system caused by COVID, which means that more and more people were on remand waiting to actually go to court to trial. Is he kind of only, from what you're saying, that's only a part of the equation?
I don't buy that. It obviously had an impact, but the truth is this has been a problem that's been years in the making. I mean, it's often been said that in the UK we're addicted to punishment, we're addicted to prison, and we've had a higher prison population than other countries in Europe for years and years, and the gap is growing. I mean, we have almost twice as many people in prison in the UK as they have in Germany, a third more than they have in France, and more than twice the populations they have in Scandinavia. And we haven't had a prison building program to deal with that. So this problem predates COVID. I don't think it's accurate to put this down to COVID. COVID exacerbated it, but the problem was here anyway.
We can come on to the rights and wrongs of that national mindset in a second, but just to focus on the technicalities for a bit longer. So this idea of reducing the tariff, so from 50%, the amount of time you have to serve your sentence before you're allowed out, down from 50 to 40, which I think Alex Chalk says it's called SDS 40 in the trade.
Technical.
Give a little bit of information is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I mean, what actually is the impact of that? Is that, I'm sort of imagining, like, what's the film? Is it a Batman film where like where the Joker lets all the prisoners out and it's just kind of like Gotham City's awash with prisoners? I mean, you sort of kind of picture that.
It's not quite going to be like that. I mean, first of all, they're going to restrict the sorts of people who can be released. We're told it's going to be non-violent offenders, no sex offenders, no violent offenders. So they're going to screen them, I think, and I would assume quite carefully. But it does mean that the prison population will go down to an extent. However, it'll only buy us, the estimate is 18 months. So it's not a solution, it's a sticking plaster. It gets us out of the immediate problem, which is where do we put prisoners next week? But it's not a solution. The solution is to think about crime and punishment in an entirely different way. And that there are some signs that the government may be going to do that. I mean, the appointment of James Timpson as Prisons Minister is, I think, very, very significant. James Timpson is the guy who runs Timpson's, the shoe menders and key cutters and so on. And they have a long track record of supporting prison reform and employing prisoners. He's a great guy. He's an interesting guy. Keir Starmer would not have appointed James Timpson to that post unless he wanted to buy into some of those ideas. And that requires, to buy into James Timpson's ideas, requires a complete rethink about the way sentencing works, about who we send to prison and who we don't send to prison.
So you think Keir Starmer genuinely accepts that reform agenda that James Timpson has been talking about for years, and not just that he wants to appear kind of open-minded or like a good guy when it comes to crime and punishment? Well, he actually genuinely...
Well, Keir's smart, and if he's appointed James Timpson as a fig leaf, it's going to blow up very quickly and it's going to end up looking bad for the government. I don't think... he's a careful guy, Keir. He thinks several steps ahead. He's very rational. He likes to plan. He likes to know where he's going. He will have thought hard about that appointment, and the fact that he's made it, I think, signifies that he wants to see some broader reform. This is not just about letting a few thousand prisoners out. This is about who do we send to prison, who really needs to be in prison, who can be dealt with outside of prison. Why is our prison population so large?
Just to rewind back to that point you were making about reducing the tariff only buys you 18 months of breathing room. Why is that, though? Because if it's a change to the sentences of lots of people and that filters through the justice system on a semi-permanent basis, why is it only... I don't understand.
Because the population is growing anyway.
Right.
The population is growing at all ends. At the lower end, the sort of people who are going to be released, it's growing at the middle end, it's growing at the higher end. So people who commit more serious offences now get much longer sentences than they got 10 or 15 years ago. People who are committing medium-style offences, medium-gravity offences, are getting much longer sentences. So sentence increase is taking place at all stages and with all categories of prisoner. And letting out a few at the bottom end, I'm afraid, is going to give us a bit of capacity in the immediate future, but it's not going to deal with the general upward trend. To do that, we've got to take much more radical measures.
Yeah, so it's what Keir Starmer actually warned against in opposition, isn't it? It's sticking plaster politics. It's like you gets you a sticking plaster on the cut, but actually you've not stopped the situation where you keep getting cut.
So James Timpson's view is that only about a third of people currently in prison ought to be there. And these are the people who are dangerous, who have to be confined because they're a threat to us. He thinks another third ought to be out in the community getting therapeutic intervention for addiction issues, mental health issues, and the other third should be doing proper community service, proper tough community service out there. And Keir Starmer knows that is James Timpson's view. So James Timpson takes the view that we should be quite drastically reducing our prison population, and not least because prison is extraordinarily expensive. Average adult prisoner, £50,000 a year to the taxpayer. A young offender, £80,000. We're building new prisons. Every new prison cell, every new cell costs £630,000 of capital expenditure. So we're talking about a very expensive system, which the recidivism figures, the figures of reoffending on the part of people who are released, demonstrate is not working. It's really bad value for public money. And I think that's what Keir Starmer and the government will focus on, the bad value for money argument.
That goes back to sort of the moral thing that you raised about why do we punish people in the way that we do? And is it just that actually a country is entitled to send this many people to prison? It's just that they have to do the other side of the equation, which is to have enough prisons? Or is it actually kind of morally wrong?
Well, from my point of view, I think that you shouldn't. That it's expensive and self-defeating to keep people in prison who are not a danger to the public, and prisoners in other categories ought to be dealt with outside prison because it's cheaper and it's more effective. The evidence shows that people on proper rehabilitative programs, people drug addicts, people with addiction issues who get proper therapeutic interventions, are less likely to offend than their counterparts who are put into prison, because in prison they don't get those proper kind of treatments, they don't get those proper kind of interventions. So it's not just a moral argument, it's a pragmatic argument. And we have to ask ourselves, why are we so different from countries in Europe? In the United States, which has also been addicted to mass incarceration, some of the most right-wing Republican states like Texas, interestingly, are moving away from it precisely on this value for money argument, that Texan Republican politicians are now saying, we're spending all this taxpayer dollar money on these guys, it's not working, it's really expensive, let's try another way. And I think that's what the Labour government, I think that's how they're going to cast it, and let's see how much progress they make.
I mean, you're not a philosopher, and I'm going to ask you a very philosophical question now, but it's like, what does it say about our society that kind of moral arguments don't seem to work, evidence arguments don't seem to work, the only thing that seems to work and convince people about prison and the failings of prison is, oh, actually there's a cheaper way? Yeah,
well, it's not a bad thing for people to focus on. I mean, I think part of the problem here has been political culture. I mean, for 30 years now, the main political parties have been trying to outbid each other in terms of, how tough we're going to be on crime. And I'm not against being tough on crime. These aren't soft options I'm talking about. But there's been a sort of political culture which has ramped up prison, which has ramped up sentencing. And of course, you're right. We can democratically make that choice. If that's what the British public want, that's fine. But we'll have to build a lot more prisons, and people will have to accept that they're going to be making the choice to build prison rather than a hospital, or prison rather than a school, and that every cell is going to cost £630,000 of their money. If that's what they want, that's a political choice, and the government can do it. I don't think that is what people want, and I don't think it's what Keir Starmer wants.
I also just don't think those numbers that you gave about the kind of the running costs of a prison cell and the building costs of a prison cell are that widely known. I've heard them a couple of times in the last 24 hours because of this conversation and Alex Chalk's interview, but I don't think I didn't certainly know those numbers off by heart, having been a political journalist for several years.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we've occasionally heard in the past that it costs as much to keep a man in prison as to send a boy to Eton, and people think, oh, that sounds terrible. Yeah, that's ridiculous. But when you actually get down into it and factor in that person will then come out of prison and almost certainly commit another offence, or there'll be a good chance that person will come out and commit another offence, then I think the cost hits home.